Hello, son.
Howdy.
I know you were in the mountains last week. I was at a beer festival in Atlanta, and it was hot by my Nordic standards. And I had on a Red Bull cap to protect my head. And I was pleasantly surprised at the number of folks who stopped to chat, asked if I was a Red Bull fan, an F1 fan. The beer festival was on qualifying, so everyone was excited for Red Bull and Max. A few excited for Alonso. So it was nice to see the growth of F1 in America continues, even deep in the South, in the heart of NASCAR country.
Yeah, that's cool. Very exciting.
Okay, you ready to go?
I am ready to go.
Hello, welcome to Hard Compound, an American take on Formula One. This is being recorded shortly after Bahrain Grand Prix. It was an interesting and exciting race with a few continuing themes and a few surprises. Patrick, son, F1 is back. Martin's grid walks are back. Red Bull is back. Alonso. I think Alonso is back. Ferrari, not so much. But we have a content-rich episode for everyone. So, son, can I get your take on Bahrain?
I think the Ferrari we know and love is indeed back. And maybe that's not such a great thing for Ferrari fans, but no, it's exciting. F1 is back. It's been a while. It's probably one of the shortest off seasons of any sport I know of, but it's always exciting when the first race begins. We saw Red Bull domination, which I don't know if we expected it or not. I think we maybe did, but also there could have been a little bit of doubt. Ferrari, unfortunate circumstances for Leclerc, sort of snatched a podium away from him. But because of that, we actually got an Alonso podium for the first time in a long time. And that is definitely something exciting. And I think, something to look forward to throughout the season is him and Aston battling with those top teams. If we get another team in the mix there, that makes F1 all the more fun and exciting to watch.
I've been a huge proponent of the new regulations, which should make cars more competitive, races more competitive. It should allow for much more overtakes. And we saw Alonso hunting down several in Bahrain. I've been a huge proponent of the spending cap. As I've said before, and this isn't just an American take, F1 is very closely following the NFL model as far as revenue generation, as far as growing all the teams, as far as sort of creating equity across all the teams. I think this is a massive boon for F1 in the long term. The valuations of teams will just continue to skyrocket. The revenue generation will just continue to increase. I also think that's going to make for more competitive races. However, having watched F1 testing closely, having watched Bahrain, it seems to me that what Red Bull has done here is put everything together exactly right just before the new rules go in place. In other words, we saw 8 years of Mercedes domination, and they were able to throw $1 billion at every problem. And Red Bull can no longer do that. For the top teams, there's spending limits. There's penalties if they go over the spending limits, which we've already seen. There's less time in testing. All of these things to create equity, more competitive racing. But just before that started, it appears that Red Bull has, in my opinion, put together the best team. They've got the best team principal in Christian Horner, even though folks may not like him, the best racer in Max Verstappen, certainly among the best strategists, designers, engineers, pit crew, and they're locked in. We could wind up this sort of odd dichotomy of the next several years of seeing maybe the most competitive racing that we've seen in a generation, but yet Max and Red Bull still pull ahead and win every year.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way from the way the season ended last year, from how testing looked, and certainly this first race of this season. I don't disagree with really anything that you just said in terms of Red Bull sort of coming together as really the dream team. I mean, they've put together from top to bottom, everyone involved, I think is among the very best in the sport at what they do. I think the first race is never, the end all be all. So I think it will hopefully continue to be an exciting season, and maybe we'll have some parity at the top. We can think back to just last season, and Ferrari sort of dominated testing, dominated the first race. Red Bull had, three really tough races in a row with some reliability issues, and then ultimately ended up coming back and just storming to the finish. So, I guess there can be hope there. But that said, Red Bull is not Ferrari. They seem to think of every little thing, every possibility, every outcome, and plan for it, adjust for it. And they seem to always make the right decisions and spend as much time as they need to get everything right. Ferrari, under a little bit of pressure, just seemed to crumble last year. And, it seems like they maybe didn't quite get it right this season either. And for now, they seem like the only team with the actual pace to compete with Red Bull. Aston and Mercedes seem just a little bit behind. But, if we're talking about apples to apples, Red Bull pace versus Ferrari pace, even if it's the same, Red Bull's going to win every single time.
I have to agree. The Ferrari has shown it has the pace. Leclerc, and Sainz are quality drivers, although I just don't think they have the talent, maybe not even the relentlessness of Max Verstappen. There's too much second guessing still going on inside Ferrari that you don't really have in Red Bull. Red Bull, everyone is focused. We'll see. And I think for, Aston and Mercedes are there in that third spot, but sort of need everything to go right if they want to get on the podium. Sort of like Alonso. I mean, he was great, but if Ferrari hadn't had the engine failure, he wouldn't be on the podium. So why don't you give me your top 5 for Bahrain?
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. I thought a lot of guys drove really well, a lot of them for new teams, some rookies, right? And then just some guys that had issues or maybe didn't have great days overall. But I think most people agree, as do I, Alonso was the driver of the day. So I have him as my top driver. It's a lot of fun to watch him race. And, he had a lot of work to do. He got lucky with the Leclerc DNF, but I mean, he had to get past Hamilton in that Mercedes. He had to hunt down Carlos Sainz in a pretty good Ferrari. He obviously had to have a good qualifying session in order to even start that high. So I thought he had an awesome race. It's really exciting to see, and, looking forward to the rest of the season for him. My number 2 driver actually is his teammate, Lance Stroll.
Wow.
I think he had a really good weekend, a really solid drive. I don't think all that many people expected him to even race this weekend, and he gritted it out and, topped George Russell among the best drivers on the grid in a solid Mercedes, was coming up on Lewis Hamilton. I mean, I thought it was a really good drive from Lance Stroll.
One race sort of really can change everything. People, I think, want to look at things over the course of a long season, but one race got George Russell from Williams to Mercedes. One race got Nick DeVry into F1 finally. One race, I think, certainly changed my opinion of Lance Stroll, and maybe most people. We all know he's in F1 because his father owns the team. Now, he's probably one of the better of the so-called daddy drivers, but he's certainly not in the league of his teammate Fernando Alonso, for example. Before the race, he had a pretty bad bike injury, injured his foot, injured his hand. There was a lot of talk he wouldn't even make it into the race. And then we heard he was still going to race, even though he didn't do the qualifying or didn't do the practice. I thought that was a selfish decision on his part. My view was he was injured, but he knew if he didn't race, the reserve driver would get the spot and the reserve driver would show him up. We'll never know if that's true, but that was a solid race by Lance Stroll, injury or no injury, and certainly changed my view of him. So you have as your top two drivers from Bahrain, Alonso and his teammate Stroll. So who do you have at three?
At 3, I have Pierre Gasly. That Alpine seemed to not be doing so great in Bahrain. Hopefully, they can pick it up throughout the season. But, his teammate Ocon had a tour day, really horrible. Gasly had a terrible qualifying session, started from the back of the grid, unfortunately, made his way all the way up into the points. I thought it was a really solid drive from him, first drive in that Alpine for him. And, I think that after a really poor season last year, this season has to go well for him. And I think, he started out with a really good drive. Then in fourth, I have Max. I don't think that this is a slight on him at all. He started from the front and raced from the front the whole time. Awesome drive from him, but in a car that is just miles and miles ahead. So we didn't really even get to see the best of him, I don't think. Obviously, a great drive. He won the race, started from pole, but without a whole lot to do, it's hard to put him up any higher for me. And then finally, I think there's plenty of guys that can finish in this spot, but I actually have Valtteri Bottas in an Alfa Romeo that looked, relatively weak compared to the rest of the field. He had a really good day, finished above, I think, where I expected him to be, and pretty comfortably at that. He seemed to have a really good race and, is proving once again that he is that number one driver and a solid veteran at that in that Alfa Romeo.
Oh, that's a great list. Alonso, Stroll, Gasly, Max, and Valtteri Bottas. For me, also at number one, like you, like almost everyone, Fernando Alonso. We've waited a decade to see him finally race again in a quality car. I don't believe the Aston is there. I think at best, even over the course of the season and with expected upgrades, it will be no better than the fourth best car. But for Fernando Alonso, that's good enough. Watching him, especially after Stroll clipped him, watching him sort of hunt down Carlos Sainz, hunt down Lewis, hunt down George Russell, overtake all of them. And even, I think, more fun, and not a lot of folks noticed this, was Alonso made Mercedes blink. Mercedes appeared to have changed their pit strategy and timing purely based on what Alonso was doing. They saw him in their rearview mirror. He was threatening, and they blinked. I don't think anyone else on the grid could have done that except probably Max. So that was just awesome to watch. Just a great race. Next, I do have Max. He has the best car, it's the best team, but I think he's also the best driver. And he has to start the season by showing us everything that they can do. And that's exactly what he did. It was a comfortable, easy victory, let's say, but you have to show up at work and you have to get it done. And he did that. My third place, similar to your second, Lance Stroll, as I said, I didn't expect him to race. And when he announced that he was going to race, I thought it was for all the wrong reasons because we all knew the reserve driver at Aston would show him up. But that was a solid race. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on him and wrong on the Aston. We'll see. It's going to be a long season, so we'll see what he and the team can do. But Bahrain, Lance Stroll, did everything right. My number 4, like you, Pierre Gasly. He's also in my top 5. He started P20, finished in P9. The Alpine team didn't look so great, didn't look ready. Ocon made multiple mistakes. His team made multiple mistakes, but Gasly just shone through. As you said, earlier, there's nowhere else for Pierre Gasly to go. He got booted from Red Bull to AlphaTauri. I know he wanted out of AlphaTauri and got with the French team Alpine, but the last couple of years he hasn't really shined. And there's a lot of young guys wanting to have that spot. So I thought this was a really solid race by Pierre Gasly. So Alonso, Max, Lance Stroll, Pierre Gasly. My number 5, the young American, Logan Sargent. It was his first ever F1 race, racing in the Williams. He had a fantastic start. He hung in there for the whole race. He had solid qualifying, not great. Solid race, not great. But when you put everything together, his very first race in Formula One, that was pretty good. I enjoyed watching him. So Alonso, Max, Lance Stroll, Pierre Gasly, and Logan Sargent.
Nice. Yeah, I'm hoping for Logan Sargent, this isn't his best race. I think the last couple of rookies that have come in, Zhou and even Yuki, their first race, they looked awesome. Got into the points with, maybe not some very good cars. But after that, just kind of faltered, didn't really do a whole lot throughout the rest of their seasons. And, I'm hoping that Logan Sargent can sort of build on this performance and continue to work his way through the field and even challenge his teammate Alex Albon, who I think also had a very good race this weekend.
That's an interesting point. That would be fun to watch. And speaking of Logan Sargent, any thoughts on how the rookies did overall? So Logan Sargent, Oscar Piastri, and Nick DeVries.
Well, just from the race, seemed like Logan Sargent was probably the best performing rookie. Unfortunately for Oscar Piastri, we didn't even really get the chance to see what he could do. But I mean, McLaren were woeful anyways. So, I think Lando, even though, he finished the race, maybe had a worse day than Piastri did.
McLaren are lost. They are doing great innovative stuff in the branding, like with the digital ads, bringing in so many sponsors. But, Zach Brown's been there for years now. It's like Gunther Steiner with Haas. It's like they've been there for years, but the results on track are not there. If McLaren is as bad as they've looked this early in the season, then I think, Zach Brown needs to do what he did to Daniel Ricciardo, which was unceremoniously dump him. So he needs to be gone soon. We'll see. I hate to be so mean to the team, but this has been years under Zach's leadership, and I've not seen the results.
Yeah, it's been disappointing to start the season for them. I mean, if they don't get their act together, then from just a couple years ago, fighting with Ferrari for third place in the constructors, they are just tumbling down and, squabbling with Haas and Williams and AlphaTauri for the scraps, the last couple points positions, maybe in a race. So that is not where McLaren should be. But just based on the overall performance of the car, it's kind of where they look like they deserve to be at the moment. And that is disappointing for two young drivers who I think are very talented and could be, really exciting to watch in the right car.
Yeah, Lando and Piastri, that's a good team. They deserve a car. And continue on the theme of the rookie rundown. I thought Logan had a great race. Piastri just really didn't have the chance because the car was just bad. DeVries, we know he has the talent. He's shown it elsewhere, but was nothing special last week at Bahrain.
Yeah, I agree. I think, that AlphaTauri, like I said, is going to be, maybe just fighting for scraps. But, Yuki did that. He was really, a couple of tenths away from getting that last points position, snatching it away from Albon. But he looked solid and, like he was fighting for something. DeVries just kind of looked like he was almost going through the motions in that car and didn't really expect to get a whole lot from the drive. And, I hope that he is able to pick it up throughout the season and really fight. Last year when he came in for that one race, he looked desperate for a spot. And I think that allowed him to drive really well. And I think he needs that sort of tenacity to come through this season for him as well.
What was your best surprise in the Bahrain Grand Prix?
Best surprise? I mean, probably has to be the Alonso podium. I don't know that anybody really expected that. We saw Aston could be quick, but I mean, for Alonso in his first race with that team and that team's first race after really a pretty dismal season last year to get on the podium and just the excitement from the team and from him, that was really fun to watch. I think it was a good surprise. And, I think it'll be fun for the rest of the season if we get more moments like that, not just from Alonso and Aston, but from other guys and other teams as well.
Yeah, I'm sort of hedging it here a little bit. For me, the best surprise was Alonso in a solid car, great race, getting on the podium, and the hint that maybe Aston belongs, if not yet in the top three, maybe nipping there. I think Mercedes will still prove superior, but having Aston finally compete, looking good after all these years, that to me was the best surprise. The biggest disappointment for me was not, for example, McLaren, who we just badmouthed, but to me was Ferrari. A DNF. I realize it's just the first race of the season. They have a new boss there. The car has shown solid pace to maybe equal Red Bull, certainly on some tracks, but I don't know. I'm already losing faith.
I guess that's fair. I don't know. McLaren was more disappointing for me. They also had a DNF and then forced Lando, who I think is one of the most exciting, fun drivers, one of the best drivers on the grid, to pit like 6 fucking times. Like, get your act together. This is F1. This is the first race of the season. Figure it out. I don't know. They were far more disappointing to me than Ferrari was.
You could be right. It's probably quite a big tell when you're a 20-something F1 driver making millions of dollars a year, and there are people questioning whether you should have actually signed with that team because they're so bad. I'm hoping McLaren fixes it, but for me, I still have Ferrari.
I'm afraid that this is, going back to the Alonso Jensen Button era where McLaren just were the saddest, most frustrating team on the grid for no good reason either. I don't know. I'm worried for that team.
Well, what was the worst part? Who had like the worst Grand Prix in Bahrain? Team, person, driver, car. For me, it had to be Ocon. Everything went wrong for Ocon. He had pit lane penalties, multiple penalties. He had a starting penalty. They screwed up on penalties, which gave them more penalties. Just a wretched race for Ocon.
I think that's a good one. I feel like that would probably be mine too. But, I also think probably Piastri just not even getting a chance to really race in his first F1 race with all the drama that he sort of caused last year with Alpine and McLaren and everything, to just not even get the chance in the first race of the season to sort of prove his worth or anything like that.
That's a good
That
one.
sucks.
That might, yeah, that's a good one too.
But yeah, I mean, Ocon just screwing up at the start and then on multiple occasions, and then the team doing the same thing. I mean, that's just garbage too.
Yeah. It's like the NFL season. There's in NFL, there's 17 races in the playoffs. You can't take your time to be ready. You have to be ready at the very start. Alpine was not. McLaren definitely was not. Based on testing, based on a whole one Grand Prix, and your vast knowledge, what is your revised top 10? How do you see the top 10 playing out at the end of the season on the drivers?
Hmm.
Would you like me to go first, Patrick, while you think about this? because I have written mine down.
Sure.
Max and Sergio, because the Red Bull is so good, I think Sergio will take second. It's like the days with Mercedes and Bottas taking second. My number 3, and I had not expected this at all, even after testing, because I refused to believe it. But after one whole race, my number 3 in the driver standings, I believe it will be Fernando Alonso. I believe he will accumulate enough points. I am not convinced he will get a win this year. I just don't believe that Aston can compete for wins, but I do believe it can compete with points, especially with Fernando there. So he, I believe, will finish third in the driver standings. My fourth, the hapless Charles Leclerc, just such a good driver, but Ferrari has a proven ability to screw up, and I think that will knock him down to fourth. My number 5, Lewis Hamilton. No team, I think, does a better job of progressing throughout the year than Mercedes. There are a few drivers as good as Lewis. He's not at his peak, but he's still great. Lewis Hamilton. 6, Carlos Sainz. 7, George Russell. So as you can see, my top 3 teams are Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes, with Alonso being the wild card. I then have, this was tough. I put Pierre Gasly. As you hinted at, he's under the gun this year. He needs to show what he can do. And that midfield right now looks wide open. Alpine, first race notwithstanding, is fairly consistent. So I think he's going to outperform his team, outperform Ocon. I have him 8th. Then the veteran Valtteri Bottas. He's just such a solid driver, rarely makes mistakes. I have him 9th. And then Lance Stroll, that Aston showing all of us can do much better than we had expected. So Max, Sergio, Alonso, Leclerc, Hamilton, Sainz, Russell, Gasly, Bottas, and Stroll. Who do you think will be your top 10, Patrick, at the end of the year based on one race?
I was writing mine down as you were going through those, and mine seems pretty similar. Just based off this first race, it seems pretty clear that Max will end in first. So, you know, just with how good he is and how dominant Red Bull looks like they are and obviously were last year, then I think Perez probably the car is there. And, you know, if they're that good, there's no real point in saying Perez won't be number 2, I think. I think he was not very good last year and ended up just a few points behind Leclerc, but I think he should have been miles ahead. And I think, with the start to this season, it looks like he probably will be this year.
I don't think Perez is a great driver, but he's a solid driver. Red Bull have the best car, I think, but also I just think they have the best crew, the best team. When they were way back, 12 races a year or something, anything could happen. But we now have F1 with over 20 races a year competing across several continents. You need to have a good, strong, solid team. Red Bull, I think, have the best team in F1, better than Mercedes, even better than Ferrari, certainly better than, I think anyone else. And so I think that's going to pay off over the course of a 20 plus race season. So I think you and I having Sergio Perez as the number 2 is a pretty easy pick.
Yeah, I think that's fair. This, I think, is where I differ from you a little bit. Drivers are important. I think teams maybe can be a little bit more important in F1. In third, I have Lewis Hamilton.
Wow.
I think Mercedes is the second best team, and Lewis Hamilton is no stranger to winning. He is among the very best ever. And I just think with a solid team, a solid car, he'll be okay. And I think he'll finish third ultimately. Then I have the unfortunate Charles Leclerc in his Ferrari in fourth. I think he races really well, especially when, it's pretty evident that he shouldn't be winning. I think, he's always a very solid driver. And I think this season that'll come through, but I just don't think the Ferrari's good enough to beat Red Bull or really Mercedes consistently.
If Ferrari can't consistently beat Mercedes, then there needs to be wholesale firings, I think, even the new driver lineup, because that one is a bit shocking to me, honestly. You having Hamilton and Mercedes ahead of McLaren, Ferrari.
Yeah, yeah. Then I have Alonso. I think Alonso he's fun. He's exciting. He races really hard and seems like he has a pretty good car. I don't think that he will be able to just will that car ahead of Mercedes and Ferrari every single week, but I think he'll do it enough to get him in the top 5 by the end of the season. Then I have George Russell. Again, a solid Mercedes driver. I don't believe in him as much as I think everybody else does, but I think he will be a consistent top 5, top 6 kind of driver this season.
Well, he is our Bond villain after all. And,
This
they
is
can't
true.
survive at some point,
As long as, he doesn't crash into too many people, he'll probably
Right,
finish in the top 6, I think.
right.
Then I have Carlos Sainz. I think if this race was any indication, he is not as good of a driver as Charles Leclerc is. Really solid and, is pretty consistent overall. But, I think he will finish behind all of those other drivers in the top 3 teams. Then I agree with you. This is kind of where it gets a little bit tricky, trying to figure out, who from all of the other teams is going to be up here. I think I'm going to agree with you. Gasly will be in 8th place come end of season. In that Alpine, I think this was a horrible start for that team, but they are usually very consistent and usually end up right around there, 7, 8, 9, something like that. So I'm going to expect him to be right around there by the end of the season. And then I have his teammate, Ocon. I think, both Alpines seem to be pretty consistently close together in the standings. I know they were last year. And I think Ocon will be right there with Gasly as well throughout the season.
If those two are really competing for, say, 8th and ninth, or for races every week, that's gonna be fun to watch because I don't believe they like each other. In Ocon's defense, I don't believe he likes anyone.
I was just
So
going to say
Gasly
that.
just another person. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
So that could be fun. We love the drama. So
Yeah. I think Ocon comes off as like very French. He just doesn't like anybody and he doesn't
right.
like anything and everyone's out to get him. But yeah, I think it'll be fun to watch those two battle. I think they're close in talent and consistency. And I think that Alpine team is going to be fun. Then finally, I don't know who to put here in 10. I kind of want to make it a little bit silly, but ultimately, I think with the performance that he had this weekend in a seemingly solid car, I'll take Lance Stroll, P10 at the end of the season. I think, he's proven throughout his time in F1, he's a fairly decent driver. If he has a good car, all the better. And I just think that he'll end up with around the same amount of points as those Alpines will.
Okay. So you have Max and Sergio, Lewis, then Leclerc and Alonso, George Russell and Carlos Sainz, Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon, and Lance Stroll. So based on testing in one race and our vast F1 knowledge, if I were to pick what I think will be the constructor standings at the end of the year, we're probably similar. So I would say Red Bull. I have Ferrari next. You might swap that. Then Mercedes, then Aston, then Alpine. So Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston, Alpine. That's what I think the constructors will be this year. What about you?
Yeah, I would say Red Bull for sure, number one. I'm thinking Mercedes will top Ferrari. So I would say Mercedes, Ferrari.
Yeah, for all the drama we've heard, all the hand-wringing we've heard from Mercedes fans, from Lewis fans after one race, they have a solid car, a strong team, a great driver lineup. They always improve, I think, more than all the other teams, certainly more than most. I think you picking them to come in second in the constructors and me having them third is really how it's going to be. I think a lot of the hand wringing is just sort of unnecessary.
Well, Mercedes and Hamilton and Russell are like the biggest sandbaggers I've ever seen in the sport.
Oh yeah.
It is very irksome sometimes, like how much they downplay their abilities or, their work. It can be very frustrating sometimes because they're better than they say they are. And that is like so annoying to me.
Right. So I think in 9 years it was eight first places and just missing out on second place by a few.
Yeah.
Right? Was it? It's like okay, life is good at Mercedes.
Yeah, agreed. And then, I think Aston, from what we've seen in testing and in this first race, they seem to have put it together better and more quickly than Alpine has, and certainly than McLaren, who would be the other team I would expect to be up in this area. So I think I would say Aston 4, like you, and then Alpine 5, like you. Just from what we've seen so far, it doesn't really seem like any other team currently is going to crack that top 5. So I'm with you, same top 5, and just flip flop Mercedes and Ferrari.
Right. You have Mercedes number 2, I have them 3, you have Ferrari 3, I have them 2, otherwise it's the same. I will say this though, as much as Mercedes has enjoyed life at the top, as much as they sandbag, I have them finishing third, which is fine. You have them second. I am a little eagerly suspicious because their car didn't look as great as we expected. And for those of us who've been watching, for example, Hamilton and Alonso for many, many years, that race was fun to watch. Bahrain was fun to watch, watching Alonso hunt them down. But as I mentioned earlier, he really got Mercedes to blink. He pushed at them. They were, I think, a little bit worried about tire degradation, when to pit, when was the best time, about undertakes. And maybe Mercedes has had it so easy for so long that it's made them soft. Alonso may have exposed something there. We're used to Mercedes sandbagging and then winning, but their car didn't look as great as we expected, and they blinked. So maybe it was just a one off. We'll see. I think it was just a one off, but I almost hope it isn't, just because I want to see how they respond when they face true adversity. The adversity of not having first place after 8 years is not really adversity. Now they face it. So I'm curious to see what this looks like. Okay, Alonso was the surprise on the podium at Bahrain. Who do you think, or what do you think, belongs on the virtual podium?
Ooh, yeah, back to virtual podium. This is the first race of the season. I have some thoughts on the location of the first race of the season, but I'll save that for later. I thought Alonso getting on the podium was special, but I loved the reactions from the Aston Martin mechanics as Alonso passed Hamilton and then went to hunt down signs and pass signs and got into that podium position. They were shocked and like nervous and super excited and just like giddy. It was a lot of fun to just sort of watch their reactions and see like how much they care. All of their hard work is paying off and the team's work is, sort of paying off. And I think that's something that's really special about Formula One. And it really is a team sport. And to see that sort of reaction from them, I thought was very cool.
That's awesome. They also belonged on the virtual podium. I had them there as well. But let's put something else on, and I'm going to nominate the Aston Martin stock price. Once Fernando did so well in qualifying and then got on the podium. The Nando effect on the Aston Martin stock price was huge. And so I think Aston Martin, the share price, belongs on the virtual podium. Switching to the soft compound, Patrick, is George Russell lobbying inside Mercedes to put the focus on the 24 car? You know, Lewis Hamilton is after all the records. He's after an 8th championship. Time is running out. I'm not sure Lewis will ever win another race. I'm going to say it right now. Lewis Hamilton will never win another F1 race. But if he does, if he is going to win another F1 race, and if he is going to win an 8th world championship, they need to fix this car soon. He's not getting any younger. However, George Russell has his best years ahead of him. And I wonder if there's any sort of lobbying, any bickering, any infighting going on at Mercedes of where to put the focus, on improving this car, this year's car, or, for example, coming up with something completely different to help them in 24 and 25 when Russell, in my opinion, have passed the older veteran Lewis Hamilton. Any thoughts on this, Patrick?
I wouldn't necessarily be surprised.
He is a villain after all.
He is a villain. I think that's very obvious. But, I think that Mercedes are not going to allow him to call the shots. They will do what they think is best for their current development and future development and ensure that they have the best chance to win now and in the future. That may look different to different people within the organization. I'm sure George is, hoping that they can get back to their sort of ruthless domination of F1 while he is still with the team and probably by that point, the number one driver on the team. But I'm not so sure that they are going to be so quick to change gears and look to the future when they're one race into this season. Doesn't look great, but, they're only like 25 points behind Red Bull or something like that for first currently, right? It's only one race. So they can make that up in no time if they can figure out how to, I guess. And, each constructor position gets you like millions of dollars more by the end of the season. So, I'm sure they don't want to let that slip away either, right? So I expect them to be doing sort of both. They have a big enough organization to do both and, enough resources to develop now and for the future. But I do agree, George is a villain and he's probably doing everything in his power to make sure that he wins in the future.
Across the line, that is our segment where we predict the outcome of the next race. Now, we waited 100 days or so for F1 to begin, and it began in Bahrain in the Middle East. And then, for reasons I cannot explain, they decided to take a week break off before going to Saudi Arabia. I actually forgot to do the Across the Line segment last week, Patrick, so we were not able to put in our predictions for Bahrain. I did not have Alonso, I will say that. So, how Across the Line works is we tally the points up at the end of the season. All rights and privileges go to the ultimate winner. Patrick chooses his top 5 for each race. I choose my top 5. 3 points if you guess the driver in the exact spot. 1 point if they do finish in the top 5. We've changed it slightly this year. We can choose the same drivers. Before, if Patrick took a driver, he was no longer available. If I took a driver, he was no longer available. That's no longer the case. So we choose our top 5. If they come in the exact spot, that's 3 points. If they come in the top 5, that's 1 point. Patrick, who do you have as your top 5 for Saudi Arabia?
Top 5 for Saudi Arabia. Here we go. I'm going to say that Max wins in Saudi Arabia. Second win in a row for him. Then I think Leclerc probably. So same 1-2 as last year. You know what? Let's just make it the same podium. I'll take Sainz P3.
All right. And 4 and 5?
4 Lewis Hamilton, 5 Sergio Perez.
Okay. I would love to see a podium with all 3 world champions, Max, Lewis, and Alonso. I am not predicting that for Saudi Arabia. I have Max in the best car. He finishes P1. Then, like you, Charles Leclerc. My P3 is just what it was here in Bahrain. Alonso, I believe that will be his 100th podium.
Wow.
I know. He's been doing this a long time. He's been doing this almost as long as you've been alive. My 4th, Sergio Perez, and my 5th is Carlos Sainz. So you have Max, Charles, Carlos, Lewis, and Sergio. I have Max, Charles, Fernando, Sergio, and Carlos. Any crazy predictions, Patrick, for Saudi Arabia Grand Prix or the season?
Crazy predictions. Let's see. I think that the 3 rookies will all collide with each other and take each other out in Saudi Arabia. All 3 of them are going to be very frustrated with each other and not finish the race.
It's a little disheartening that they are all in such bad cars.
Yeah.
Logan in the Williams, which will apparently forever be bad. De Vries, the AlphaTauri, which, as you know, in my conspiracy theory, I think the Red Bull ownership is sabotaging that team because they want to sell it for big money. And then inexplicably, whatever Zach Brown is doing wrong, Oscar Piastri and the McLaren, they just can't seem to get their act together. So that would be a horrible one if it happened, but interesting because I could see all the rookies they're finally in F1. They're trying so hard to stand out, to make a name for themselves, and they're all in garbage cars. I gave my crazy prediction earlier, which was Lewis Hamilton will never win another race. Fernando Alonso, however, will. So that's my crazy prediction. Even 1 year ago, that would have been insane to believe. And now it might be crazy, but it just might work.
Yeah, that would be cool. I would like to see that.
All right. I wish to remind our listeners, send your questions or comments to hardcompoundpod@gmail.com. We may read them on the show. We definitely will read them. And thank you for listening to everybody's most beloved father and son F1 podcast. And we are Lights Out.
See ya. Thanks for listening.
Good show, son. We may have been a bit hard on George Russell, but it's all in good fun. I thought it was funny because as much as you and I call him the James Bond villain of F1, I was watching the pre-race show and they were playing the Bahrain national anthem, which apparently there is one. And it just looked like he was having a great time. He was just rocking along to the Bahrain national anthem, which made me chuckle. And I started to like the guy. You know, when I was in the Atlanta Beer Festival, it was surprising how many folks noticed my Red Bull cap, which I was only wearing because of the sun. And this happens to be the thinnest cap I owned. I only needed it for that. I did not want something to keep my head warm. But, several folks stopped me, pointed out. I saw a few other folks with some F1 gear, but there's certainly a huge market. We see everyone out here in the US with the NFL jerseys, with the college football and basketball jerseys, NBA jerseys, a few MLS, a few hockey if you're in the right spots. There's definitely a market for the F1 gear. I'm sure that's going to just continue to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that they really ought to start the season in the US. You know, I think that starting in the Middle East just seems weird to me. Maybe that's not weird for like Europeans or something, but I don't know. In the US, I feel like it would feel like more of a celebration and a party. Oh, the season is back, it's starting again. It didn't seem that way in Bahrain. It just seemed like another race, which I don't know, to me was a little bit disappointing because I always
Yeah,
liked when they did it in Australia,
that was always so much fun.
but I think it would be really cool if they started in like Austin and then, finished in Vegas. It would be cool to start and end in the US, but
That
obviously
we
that's
need
a
to make
biased
that happen.
opinion. So,
I mean, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Qatar, the Middle Eastern states are throwing their oil money around, and so they can obviously pay enough for F1 to open the season there. But long term, uh, you know, uh, F1 is moving closer and closer toward the US. That would be awesome. Opening in the US, let's say in Texas, ending in the US, for example, Las Vegas. Wow, that's a great idea. We have to make that happen, son.